Phoenix Audio. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Narrated by Gwendolyn Yo. The old woman remembered a swan she had bought many years ago in Shanghai for a foolish sum. This bird, boasted the market vendor, was once a duck that stretched its neck in hopes of becoming a goose, and now look, it is too beautiful to eat. Then the woman and the swan sailed across an ocean many thousands of li wide, stretching their necks toward America. On her journey, she cooed to the swan, "In America, I will have a daughter just like me. But over there, nobody will say her worth is measured by the loudness of her husband's belch. Over there, nobody will look down on her, because I will make her speak only perfect American English. And over there she will always be too full to swallow any sorrow. She will know my meaning because I will give her this swan, a creature that became more than what was hoped for." But when she arrived in the new country, the immigration officials pulled her swan away from her, leaving the woman fluttering her arms and with only one swan feather for a memory. And then she had to fill out so many forms, she forgot why she had come and what she had left behind. Now the woman was old, and she had a daughter who grew up speaking only English and swallowing more Coca-Cola than sorrow. For a long time now, the woman had wanted to give her daughter the single swan feather and tell her, "This feather may look worthless, but it comes from afar and carries with it all my good intentions." And she waited, year after year, for the day she could tell her daughter this in perfect American English. Jing Mei Wu, The Joy Luck Club. My father has asked me to be the fourth corner at the Joy Luck Club. I am to replace my mother, whose seat at the mahjong table has been empty since she died 2 months ago. My father thinks she was killed by her own thoughts.
"She had a new idea inside her head,"
said my father.
"But before it could come out of her mouth, the thought grew too big and burst. It must have been a very bad idea."
The doctor said she died of a cerebral aneurysm, and her friends at the Joy Luck Club said she died just like a rabbit, quickly and with unfinished business left behind. My mother was supposed to host the next meeting of the Joy Luck Club. The week before she died, she called me full of pride, full of life. "Auntie Lynn cooked red bean soup for Joy Luck. I'm going to cook black sesame seed soup." "Don't show off," I said.
"It's not show off."
She said the two soups were almost the same, 差不多. Or maybe she said 普通, not the same thing at all. It was one of those Chinese expressions that means the better half of mixed intentions. I can never remember things I didn't understand in the first place. My mother started the San Francisco version of the Joy Luck Club in 1949, 2 years before I was born. This was the year my mother and father left China with one stiff leather trunk filled only with fancy silk dresses. There was no time to pack anything else, my mother had explained to my father after they boarded the boat. Still, his hands swam frantically between the slippery silks, looking for his cotton shirts and wool pants. When they arrived in San Francisco, my father made her hide those shiny clothes. She wore the same brown-checked Chinese dress until the Refugee Welcome Society gave her 2 hand-me-down dresses, all too large in sizes for American women. The society was composed of a group of white-haired American missionary ladies from the First Chinese Baptist Church. And because of their gifts, my parents could not refuse their invitation to join the church, nor could they ignore the old ladies' practical advice to improve their English through Bible study class on Wednesday nights and, later, through choir practice on Saturday mornings. This was how my parents met the Sues, the Zhongs, and the St. Clairs. My mother could sense that the women of these families also had unspeakable tragedies they had left behind in China and hopes they couldn't begin to express in their fragile English. Or at least, my mother recognized the numbness in these women's faces, and she saw how quickly their eyes moved when she told them her idea for the Joy Luck Club. Joy Luck was an idea my mother remembered from the days of her first marriage in Guilin, before the Japanese came. That's why I think of Joy Luck as her Guilin story. It was the story she would always tell me when she was bored, when there was nothing to do, when every bowl had been washed and the formica table had been wiped down twice, when my father sat reading the newspaper and smoking one Pall Mall cigarette after another, a warning not to disturb him. This is when my mother would take out a box of old ski sweaters sent to us by unseen relatives from Vancouver. She would snip the bottom of a sweater and pull out a kinky thread of yarn, anchoring it to a piece of cardboard. And as she began to roll with one sweeping rhythm, she would start her story. Over the years, she told me the same story, except for the ending, which grew darker, casting long shadows into her life, and eventually into mine. I dreamed about Guilin before I ever saw it. My mother began speaking Chinese. I dreamed of jagged peaks lining a curving river with magic moss screening the banks. At the tops of these peaks were white mists, and if you could float down this river and eat the moss for food, you would be strong enough to climb the peak. If you slipped, you would only fall into a bed of soft moss and laugh. And once you reached the top, you would be able to see everything and feel such happiness it would be enough to never have worries in your life ever again. In China, everybody dreamed about Guilin, and when I arrived, I realized how shabby my dreams were, how poor my thoughts. When I saw the hills, I laughed and shuddered at the same time. The peaks looked like giant fried fish heads trying to jump out of a vat of oil. Behind each hill, I could see shadows of another fish, and then another and another. And then the clouds would move just a little, and the hills would suddenly become monstrous elephants marching slowly toward me. Can you see this? And at the root of the hill were secret caves. Inside grew hanging rock gardens in the shapes and colors of cabbage, winter melons, turnips, and onions. These were things so strange and beautiful, you can't ever imagine them. But I didn't come to Guilin to see how beautiful it was. The man who was my husband brought me and our 2 babies to Guilin because he thought we would be safe. He was an officer with the Kuomintang, and after he put us down in a small room in a 2-story house, he went off to the northwest, to Chongqing. We knew the Japanese were winning, even when the newspapers said they were not. Every day, every hour, thousands of people poured into the city, crowding the sidewalks, looking for places to live. They came from the east, west, north, and south. They were rich and poor, Shanghainese, Cantonese, Northerners, and not just Chinese, but foreigners and missionaries of every religion. And there was, of course, the Kuomintang and their army officers who thought they were top level to everyone else. We were a city of leftovers mixed together. If it hadn't been for the Japanese, there would have been plenty of reason for fighting to break out among these different people. Can you see it? Shanghai people with North Water peasants, bankers with barbers, rickshaw pullers with Burma refugees. Everybody looked down on someone else. It didn't matter that everybody shared the same sidewalk to spit on and suffered the same fast-moving diarrhea. We all had the same stink, but everybody complained someone else smelled the worst. Me? Oh, I hated the American Air Force officers who said hubba hubba sounds to make my face turn red.
But the worst were the northern peasants who emptied their noses into their hands and pushed people around and gave everybody their dirty diseases. So you can see how quickly Quay Lin lost its beauty for me. I no longer climbed the peaks to say, how lovely are these hills. I only wondered which hills the Japanese had reached. I sat in the dark corners of my house with a baby under each arm, waiting with nervous feet. When the sirens cried out to warn us of bombers, my neighbors and I jumped to our feet and scurried to the deep caves to hide like wild animals. But you can't stay in the dark for so long. Something inside of you starts to fade, and you become like a starving person, crazy hungry for light. Outside I could hear the bombing, boom, boom, and then the sound of raining rocks. And inside I was no longer hungry for the cabbage or the turnips of the hanging rock garden. I could only see the dripping bowels of an ancient hill that might collapse on top of me. Can you imagine how it is to want to be neither inside nor outside? To want to be nowhere and disappear? So when the bombing sounds grew farther away, we would come back out like newborn kittens, scratching our way back to the city. And always, I would be amazed to find the hills against the burning sky had not been torn apart. I thought up Joy Luck on a summer night that was so hot even the moths fainted to the ground. Their wings were so heavy with the damp heat. Every place was so crowded there was no room for fresh air. Unbearable smells from the sewers rose up to my second-story window, and the stink had nowhere else to go but into my nose. At all hours of the night and day, I heard screaming sounds. I didn't know if it was a peasant slitting the throat of a runaway pig or an officer beating a half-dead peasant for lying in his way on the sidewalk. I didn't go to the window to find out. What use would it have been? And that's when I thought I needed something to do to help me move. My idea was to have a gathering of 4 women, one for each corner of my mahjong table. I knew which women I wanted to ask. They were all young like me, with wishful faces. One was an army officer's wife like myself. Another was a girl with very fine manners from a rich family in Shanghai. She had escaped with only a little money. And there was a girl from Nanking who had the blackest hair I have ever seen. She came from a low-class family, but she was pretty and pleasant and had married well to an old man who died and left her with a better life. Each week, one of us would host a party to raise money and to raise our spirits. The hostess had to serve special Tianxing foods to bring good fortune of all kinds. Dumplings shaped like silver money ingots, long rice noodles for long life, boiled peanuts for conceiving sons, and of course, many good luck oranges for a plentiful sweet life. What fine food we treated ourselves to with our meager allowances. We didn't notice that the dumplings were stuffed mostly with stringy squash and that the oranges were spotted with wormy holes. We ate sparingly, not as if we didn't have enough, but to protest how we could not eat another bite. We had already bloated ourselves from earlier in the day. We knew we had luxuries few people could afford. We were the lucky ones. After filling our stomachs, we would then fill a bowl with money and put it where everyone could see. Then we would sit down at the mahjong table. My table was from my family and was of a very fragrant red wood, not what you call rosewood, but hongmu, which is so fine there's no English word for it. The table had a very thick pad, so that when the mahjong pie were spilled onto the table, the only sound was of ivory tiles washing against one another. Once we started to play, nobody could speak, except to say pung or ch when taking a tile. We had to play with seriousness and think of nothing else but adding to our happiness through winning. But after 16 rounds, we would again feast, this time to celebrate our good fortune. And then we would talk into the night until the morning, saying stories about good times in the past and good times yet to come. Oh, what good stories. Stories spilling out all over the place. We almost laughed to death. A rooster that ran to the house screeching on top of dinner bowls, the same bowls that held him quietly in pieces the next day. And one about a girl who wrote love letters for two friends who loved the same man. And a silly foreign lady who fainted on a toilet when firecrackers went off next to her. People thought we were wrong to serve banquets every week, while many people in the city were starving eating rats, and later the garbage that the poorest rats used to feed on. Others thought we were possessed by demons. To celebrate when even within our own families we had lost generations, had lost homes and fortunes and were separated, husband from wife, brother from sister, daughter from mother. How could we laugh? People asked. It's not that we had no heart or eyes for pain. We were all afraid. We all had our miseries. But to despair was to wish back for something already lost, or to prolong what was already unbearable. How much can you wish for a favorite warm coat that hangs in the closet of a house that burned down with your mother and father inside of it? How long can you see in your mind arms and legs hanging from telephone wires and starving dogs running down the streets with half-chewed hands dangling from their jaws? What was worse, we asked among ourselves to sit and wait for our own deaths with proper somber faces, or to choose our own happiness. So we decided to hold parties and pretend each week had become the new year. Each week we could forget past wrongs done to us. We weren't allowed to think a bad thought. We feasted, we laughed, we played games, lost and won, we told the best stories. And each week we could hope to be lucky. That hope was our only joy. And that's how we came to call our little parties Joy Luck. My mother used to end the story on a happy note, bragging about her skill at the game. I won many times and was so lucky the others teased that I had learned the trick of a clever thief, she said. I won tens of thousands of yuan, but I wasn't rich. No. By then, paper money had become worthless. Even toilet paper was worth more. And that made us laugh harder, to think 1,000 yuan note wasn't even good enough to rub on our bottoms. I never thought my mother's Quailin story was anything but a Chinese fairy tale. The endings always changed. Sometimes she said she used that worthless 1,000-yuan note to buy a half cup of rice. She turned that rice into a pot of porridge. She traded that gruel for 2 feet from a pig. Those 2 feet became 6 eggs, those eggs, 6 chickens. The story always grew and grew. And then one evening, after I had begged her to buy me a transistor radio, after she refused, and I had sulked in silence for an hour, she said, "Why do you think you are missing something you never had?" And then she told me a completely different ending to the story. "An army officer came to my house early one morning," she said, "and told me to go quickly to my husband in Chongqing. And I knew he was telling me to run away from Guilin. I knew what happened to officers and their families when the Japanese arrived. How could I go? There were no trains leaving Guilin. My friend from Nanking, she was so good to me. She bribed a man to steal a wheelbarrow used to haul coal. She promised to warn our other friends. I packed my things and my 2 babies into this wheelbarrow and began pushing to Chongqing 4 days before the Japanese marched into Guilin. On the road, I heard news of the slaughter from people running past me. It was terrible. Up to the last day, the Kuomintang insisted that Guilin was safe. protected by the Chinese army. But later that day, the streets of Guilin was strewn with newspapers reporting great Kuomintang victories, and on top of these papers, like fresh fish from a butcher, lay rows of people, men, women, and children who had never lost hope, but had lost their lives instead. When I heard this news, I walked faster and faster, asking myself at each step, were they foolish? Were they brave? I pushed toward Chongqing until my wheel broke. I abandoned my beautiful mahjong table of Hongmu. By then, I didn't have enough feeling left in my body to cry. I tied scarves into slings and put a baby on each side of my shoulder. I carried a bag in each hand, one with clothes, the other with food. I carried these things until deep grooves grew in my hands. And I finally dropped one bag after the other when my hands began to bleed and became too slippery to hold onto anything. Along the way, I saw others had done the same, gradually given up hope. It was like a pathway inlaid with treasures that grew in value along the way. Bolts of fine fabric and books, paintings of ancestors and carpenter tools, until one could see cages of ducklings now quiet with thirst, and, later still, silver urns lying in the road where people had been too tired to carry them for any kind of future hope. By the time I arrived in Chongqing, I had lost everything except for 3 fancy silk dresses, which I wore one on top of the other. "What do you mean by everything?" I gasped at the end. I was stunned to realize the story had been true all along. What happened to the babies? She didn't even pause to think. She simply said in a way that made it clear there was no more to the story. "Your father is not my first husband. You are not those babies." When I arrive at the Sue's house, where the Joy Luck Club is meeting tonight, the first person I see is my father. "There she is, never on time," he announces. And it's true. Everybody's already here. 7 family friends in their 60s and 70s. They look up and laugh at me, always tardy, a child still at 36. I'm shaking, trying to hold something inside. The last time I saw them, at the funeral, I had broken down and cried big, gulping sobs. They must wonder now how someone like me can take my mother's place. A friend once told me that my mother and I were alike, that we had the same wispy hand gestures, the same girlish laugh and sideways look. When I shyly told my mother this, she seemed insulted and said, "You don't even know little percent of me. How can you be me?" And she's right. How can I be my mother at Joy Luck? "Auntie, uncle," I say repeatedly, nodding to each person there. I've always called these old family friends auntie and uncle. And then I walk over and stand next to my father. He's looking at the Zhang's pictures from their recent China trip. "Look at that," he says politely, pointing to a photo of the Zhang's tour group standing on wide slab steps. There's nothing in this picture that shows it was taken in China rather than San Francisco or any other city for that matter. But my father doesn't seem to be looking at the picture anyway. It's as though everything were the same to him. Nothing stands out. He has always been politely indifferent. But what's the Chinese word that means indifferent because you can't see any differences? That's how troubled I think he is by my mother's death. "Will you look at that?" he says, pointing to another nondescript picture. The Sue's house feels heavy with greasy odors. Too many Chinese meals cooked in a too small kitchen. Too many once fragrant smells compressed onto a thin layer of invisible grease. I remember how my mother used to go into other people's houses and restaurants and wrinkle her nose, then whisper very loudly, "I can see and feel the stickiness with my nose." I have not been to the Sue's house in many years, but the living room is exactly the same as I remember it. When Auntie Anmei and Uncle George moved to the Sunset District from Chinatown 25 years ago,
They bought new furniture. It's all there, still looking mostly new under yellowed plastic. The same turquoise couch shaped in a semicircle of nubby tweed. The colonial end tables made out of heavy maple. A lamp of fake cracked porcelain. Only the scroll-length calendar, free from the Bank of Canton, changes every year. I remember this stuff because when we were children, Auntie Ann May didn't let us touch any of her new furniture except through the clear plastic coverings. On Joy Luck nights, my parents brought me to the zoos. Since I was the guest, I had to take care of all the younger children. So many children, it seemed, as if there were always one baby who was crying from having bumped its head on a table leg. "You are responsible," said my mother, which meant I was in trouble if anything was spilled, burned, lost, broken, or dirty. I was responsible, no matter who did it. She and Auntie Ann May were dressed up in funny Chinese dresses with stiff stand-up collars and blooming branches of embroidered silk sewn over their breasts. These clothes were too fancy for real Chinese people, I thought, and too strange for American parties. In those days, before my mother told me her Quailin story, I imagined Joy Luck was a shameful Chinese custom, like the secret gatherings of the Ku Klux Klan or the tom-tom dances of TV Indians preparing for war. But tonight, there's no mystery. The Joy Luck aunties are all wearing slacks, bright print blouses, and different versions of sturdy walking shoes. We are all seated around the dining room table under a lamp that looks like a Spanish candelabra. Uncle George puts on his bifocals and starts the meeting by reading the minutes.
Our capital account is 24,825, or about 6,206 a couple, 3,103 per person. We sold Subaru for a loss at 6 3/4. We bought 100 shares of Smith International at 7. Our thanks to Lindo and Tin Jong for the goodies. The red bean soup was especially delicious. The March meeting had to be cancelled until further notice. We were sorry to have to bid a fond farewell to our dear friend Su Yen and extended our sympathy to the Canning Wu family. Respectfully submitted, George Su, President and Secretary.
That's it. I keep thinking the others will start talking about my mother, the wonderful friendship they shared, and why I'm here in her spirit to be the fourth corner and carry on the idea my mother came up with on a hot day in Quailin. But everybody just nods to approve the minutes. Even my father's head bobs up and down routinely. And it seems to me my mother's life has been shelved for new business. Auntie Ann May heaves herself up from the table and moves slowly to the kitchen to prepare the food. And Auntie Lin, my mother's best friend, moves to the turquoise sofa, crosses her arms, and watches the men still seated at the table. Auntie Ying, who seems to shrink even more every time I see her, reaches into her knitting bag and pulls out the start of a tiny blue sweater. The Joy Luck uncles begin to talk about stocks they are interested in buying. Uncle Jack, who is Auntie Ying's younger brother, is very keen on a company that mines gold in Canada.
It's a great hedge on inflation,
he says with authority. He speaks the best English, almost accentless. I think my mother's English was the worst, but she always thought her Chinese was the best. She spoke Mandarin slightly blurred with a Shanghai dialect. "Weren't we going to play mahjong tonight?" I whisper loudly to Auntie Ying, who's slightly deaf. "Later," she says. "After midnight."
Ladies, are you at this meeting or not?
Says Uncle George. After everybody votes unanimously for the Canada gold stock, I go into the kitchen to ask Auntie Ann May why the Joy Luck Club started investing in stocks.
We used to play mahjong, winner take all. But the same people were always winning, the same people always losing,
she says. She is stuffing wonton, one chopstick jab of gingery meat dabbed onto a thin skin, and then a single fluid turn with her hand that seals the skin into the shape of a tiny nurse's cap.
You can't have luck when someone else has skill. So a long time ago, we decided to invest in the stock market. There's no skill in that. Even your mother agreed.
Auntie An Mei takes count of the tray in front of her. She's already made 5 rows of 8 wonton each.
40 wonton, 8 people, 10 each, 5 row more,
she says aloud to herself, and then continues stuffing.
We got smart. Now we can all win and lose equally. We can have stock market luck, and we can play mahjong for fun. Just for a few dollars. Winner take all. Losers take home leftovers. So everyone can have some joy. Smart, huh?
I watch Auntie An Mei make more wonton. She has quick, expert fingers. She doesn't have to think about what she's doing. That's what my mother used to complain about, that Auntie An Mei never thought about what she was doing.
She's not stupid,
said my mother on one occasion.
But she has no spine. Last week, I had a good idea for her. I said to her, let's go to the consulate and ask for papers for your brother. And she almost wanted to drop her things and go right then. But later she talked to someone, who knows who, and that person told her she can get her brother in bad trouble in China. That person said FBI will put her on a list and give her trouble in the US the rest of her life. That person said, you ask for a house loan and they say no loan, because your brother is a communist. I said, you already have a house. But still she was scared. Auntie An Mei runs this way and that, said my mother. And she doesn't know why.
As I watch Auntie An Mei, I see a short, bent woman in her 70s, with a heavy bosom and thin, shapeless legs. She has the flattened, soft fingertips of an old woman. I wonder what Auntie An Mei did to inspire a lifelong stream of criticism from my mother. Then again, it seemed my mother was always displeased with all her friends, with me, and even with my father. Something was always missing. Something always needed improving. Something was not in balance. This one or that had too much of one element, not enough of another. The elements were from my mother's own version of organic chemistry. Each person is made of 5 elements, she told me. Too much fire, and you had a bad temper. That was like my father, whom my mother always criticized for his cigarette habit, and who always shouted back that she should keep her thoughts to herself. I think he now feels guilty that he didn't let my mother speak her mind. Too little wood, and you bent too quickly to listen to other people's ideas, unable to stand on your own. This was like my Auntie An Mei. Too much water, and you flowed in too many directions, like myself, for having started half a degree in biology, then half a degree in art, and then finishing neither when I went off to work for a small ad agency as a secretary, later becoming a copywriter. I used to dismiss her criticisms as just more of her Chinese superstitions, beliefs that conveniently fit the circumstances. In my 20s, while taking Introduction to Psychology, I tried to tell her why she shouldn't criticize so much, why it didn't lead to a healthy learning environment. There's a school of thought, I said, that parents shouldn't criticize children. They should encourage instead. You know, people rise to other people's expectations, and when you criticize, it just means you're expecting failure.
That's the trouble, my mother said. You never rise, lazy to get up, lazy to rise to expectations.
Time to eat, Auntie An Mei happily announces, bringing out a steaming pot of the wonton she was just wrapping. There are piles of food on the table, served buffet style, just like at the Kuilin feasts. My father's digging into the chow mein, which sits in an oversized aluminum pan surrounded by little plastic packets of soy sauce. Auntie An Mei must have bought this on Clement Street. The wonton soup smells wonderful with delicate sprigs of cilantro floating on top. I'm drawn first to a large platter of char siu, sweet barbecued pork, cut into coin-sized slices, and then to a whole assortment of what I've always called finger goodies, thin-skinned pastries filled with chopped pork, beef, shrimp, and unknown stuffings that my mother used to describe as nutritious things. Eating is not a gracious event here. It's as though everybody had been starving. They push large forkfuls into their mouths, jab at more pieces of pork, one right after the other. They are not like the ladies of Guilin, who I always imagined savored their food with a certain detached delicacy. And then, almost as quickly as they started, the men get up and leave the table. As if on cue, the women peck at last morsels and then carry plates and bowls to the kitchen and dump them in the sink. The women take turns washing their hands, scrubbing them vigorously. Who started this ritual? I, too, put my plate in the sink and wash my hands. The women are talking about the Zhang's China trip. Then they move toward a room in the back of the apartment. We pass another room, what used to be the bedroom shared by the 4 Su sons. The bunk beds with their scuffed, splintery ladders are still there. The Joy Luck uncles are already seated at the card table. Uncle George is dealing out cards, fast, as though he learned this technique in a casino. My father's passing out Pall Mall cigarettes, with one already dangling from his lips. And then we get to the room in the back, which was once shared by the 3 Su girls. We were all childhood friends, and now they've all grown and married, and I'm here to play in their room again. Except for the smell of camphor, it feels the same, as if Rose, Ruth, and Janice might soon walk in with their hair rolled up in big orange juice cans and plop down on their identical narrow beds. The white chenille bedspreads are so worn they are almost translucent. Rose and I used to pluck the nubs out while talking about our boy problems. Everything is the same, except now a mahogany-colored mahjong table sits in the center. And next to it is a floor lamp, a long black pole with 3 oval spotlights attached like the broad leaves of a rubber plant. Nobody says to me, "Sit here. This is where your mother used to sit." But I can tell even before everyone sits down. The chair closest to the door has an emptiness to it. But the feeling doesn't really have to do with the chair. It's her place on the table. Without having anyone tell me, I know her corner on the table was the east. The east is where things begin, my mother once told me, the direction from which the sun rises, where the wind comes from. Auntie Anmei, who is sitting on my left, spills the tiles onto the green felt tabletop and then says to me, "Now we wash tiles." We swirl them with our hands in a circular motion. They make a cool swishing sound as they bump into one another. "Do you win like your mother?" asks Auntie Lin across from me. She is not smiling. I only played a little in college with some Jewish friends. "Ah, Jewish mahjong," she says in disgusted tones. "Not the same thing." This is what my mother used to say, although she could never explain exactly why. "Maybe I shouldn't play tonight. I'll just watch," I offer. Auntie Lin looks exasperated, as though I were a simple child. "How can we play with just 3 people? Like a table with 3 legs, no balance." When Auntie Ying's husband died, she asked her brother to join. Your father asked you, so it's decided. What's the difference between Jewish and Chinese mahjong? I once asked my mother. I couldn't tell by her answer if the games were different or just her attitude toward Chinese and Jewish people. "Entirely different kind of playing," she said in her English explanation voice. "Jewish mahjong, they watch only for their own tile, play only with their eyes." Then she switched to Chinese. "Chinese mahjong, you must play using your head. Very tricky. You must watch what everybody else throws away and keep that in your head as well. And if nobody plays well, then the game becomes like Jewish mahjong. Why play? There's no strategy. You're just watching people make mistakes." These kinds of explanations made me feel my mother and I spoke two different languages, which we did. I talked to her in English. She answered back in Chinese. So what's the difference between Chinese and Jewish mahjong? I ask Auntie Lin. Hey, she exclaims in a mock scolding voice. Your mother did not teach you anything? Auntie Ying pats my hand. You a smart girl. You watch us do the same. Help us stack the tiles and make 4 walls. I follow Auntie Ying, but mostly I watch Auntie Lin. She is the fastest, which means I can almost keep up with the others by watching what she does first. Auntie Ying throws the dice, and I'm told that Auntie Lin has become the east wind. I've become the north wind, the last hand to play. Auntie Ying is the south and Auntie Anmei is the west. And then we start taking tiles, throwing the dice, counting back on the wall to the right number of spots where our chosen tiles lie. I rearrange my tiles, sequences of bamboo and balls, doubles of colored numbered tiles, odd tiles that do not fit anywhere. Your mother was the best, like a pro, says Auntie Anmei, while slowly sorting her tiles, considering each piece carefully. Now we begin to play, looking at our hands, casting tiles, picking up others at an easy, comfortable pace. The Joy Luck aunties begin to make small talk, not really listening to each other. They speak in their special language, half in broken English, half in their own Chinese dialect. Auntie Ying mentions she bought yarn at half price somewhere out in the avenues. Auntie Anmei brags about a sweater she made for her daughter, Ruth's new baby. She thought it was store-bought, she says proudly. Auntie Lin explains how mad she got at a store clerk who refused to let her return a skirt with a broken zipper. I was 气死, she says, still fuming. Mad to death. But Lindo, you are still with us. You didn't die, teases Auntie Ying. And then as she laughs, Auntie Lin says, Pong! And Mahjong! And then spreads her tiles out, laughing back at Auntie Ying while counting up her points. We start washing tiles again, and it grows quiet. I'm getting bored and sleepy. Oh, I have a story, says Auntie Ying loudly, startling everybody. Auntie Ying has always been the weird auntie, someone lost in her own world. My mother used to say, Auntie Ying is not hard of hearing. She is hard of listening. Police arrested Mrs. Emerson's son last weekend, Auntie Ying says, in a way that sounds as if she were proud to be the first with this big news. Mrs. Chan told me at church, too many TV sets found in his car. Auntie Lin quickly says, Hi, Mrs. Emerson, good lady, meaning Mrs. Emerson didn't deserve such a terrible son. But now I see this is also said for the benefit of Auntie Anmei, whose own youngest son was arrested 2 years ago for selling stolen car stereos. Auntie Anmei is rubbing her tile carefully before discarding it. She looks pained. Everybody has TVs in China now, says Auntie Lin, changing the subject. Our family there all has TV sets, not just black and white, but color and remote. They have everything. So when we asked them what we should buy them, they said nothing. It was enough that we would come to visit them. But we bought them different things anyway. VCR and Sony Walkman for the kids. They said no, don't give it to us. But I think they liked it. Poor Auntie Anmei rubs her tiles ever harder. I remember my mother telling me about the Sue's trip to China 3 years ago. Auntie Anmei had saved $2,000, all to spend on her brother's family. She had shown my mother the insides of her heavy suitcase. One was crammed with C's, nuts and chews, M&Ms, candy-coated cashews, instant hot chocolate with miniature marshmallows. My mother told me the other bag contained the most ridiculous clothes, all new. Bright California-style beachwear, baseball caps, cotton pants with elastic waists, bomber jackets, Stanford sweatshirts, crew socks. My mother had told her,
Who wants those useless things? They just want money.
But Auntie Ann May said her brother was so poor and they were so rich by comparison. So she ignored my mother's advice and took the heavy bags and their $2,000 to China. And when their China tour finally arrived in Hangzhou, the whole family from Ningbo was there to meet them. It wasn't just Auntie Ann May's little brother, but also his wife's stepbrothers and stepsisters, and a distant cousin, and that cousin's husband, and that husband's uncle. They had all brought their mothers-in-law and children, and even their village friends who were not lucky enough to have overseas Chinese relatives to show off. As my mother told it,
Auntie Ann May had cried before she left for China, thinking she would make her brother very rich and happy by communist standards. But when she got home, she cried to me that everyone had a palm out, and she was the only one who left with an empty hand.
My mother confirmed her suspicions. Nobody wanted the sweatshirts, those useless clothes. The M&Ms were thrown in the air, gone, and when the suitcases were emptied, the relatives asked what else the Sioux had brought. Auntie Ann May and Uncle George were shaken down, not just for $2,000 worth of TVs and refrigerators, but also for a night's lodging for 26 people in the overlooking the lake hotel, for 3 banquet tables at a restaurant that catered to rich foreigners, for 3 special gifts for each relative, and finally, for a loan of 5,000 yuan in foreign exchange to a cousin's so-called uncle who wanted to buy a motorcycle, but who later disappeared, for good, along with the money. When the train pulled out of Hangzhou the next day, the Sioux found themselves depleted of some $9,000 worth of goodwill. Months later, after an inspiring Christmas-time service at the First Chinese Baptist Church, Auntie Ann May tried to recoup her loss by saying it truly was more blessed to give than to receive, and my mother agreed. Her longtime friend had blessings for at least several lifetimes. Listening now to Auntie Lin bragging about the virtues of her family in China, I realize that Auntie Lin is oblivious to Auntie Ann May's pain. Is Auntie Lin being mean, or is it that my mother never told anybody but me the shameful story of Auntie Ann May's greedy family? "So, Jingmei, you go to school now?" says Auntie Lin. "Her name is June. They all go by their American names," says Auntie Ying. "That's okay," I say, and I really mean it. In fact, it's even becoming fashionable for American-born Chinese to use their Chinese names. "I'm not in school anymore, though," I say. "That was more than 10 years ago." Auntie Lin's eyebrows arch. "Maybe I'm thinking of someone else's daughter," she says, but I know right away she's lying. I know my mother probably told her I was going back to school to finish my degree, because somewhere back, maybe just 6 months ago, we were again having this argument about my being a failure, a college drop-off, about my going back to finish. Once again, I had told my mother what she wanted to hear. "You're right. I'll look into it." I had always assumed we had an unspoken understanding about these things, that she didn't really mean I was a failure, and I really meant I would try to respect her opinions more. But listening to Auntie Lin tonight reminds me once again, my mother and I never really understood one another. We translated each other's meanings, and I seemed to hear less than what was said, while my mother heard more. No doubt she told Auntie Lin I was going back to school to get a doctorate. Auntie Lin and my mother were both best friends and arch enemies who spent a lifetime comparing their children. I was 1 month older than Waverly Zhang, Auntie Lin's prized daughter. From the time we were babies, our mothers compared the creases in our belly buttons, how shapely our earlobes were, how fast we healed when we scraped our knees, how thick and dark our hair, how many shoes we wore out in 1 year, and later, how smart Waverly was at playing chess, how many trophies she had won last month, how many newspapers had printed her name, how many cities she had visited. I know my mother resented listening to Auntie Lin talk about Waverly when she had nothing to come back with, At first, my mother tried to cultivate some hidden genius in me. She did housework for an old retired piano teacher down the hall who gave me lessons and free use of a piano to practice on in exchange. When I failed to become a concert pianist or even an accompanist for the church youth choir, she finally explained that I was late blooming, like Einstein, who everyone thought was retarded until he discovered a bomb. Now it is Auntie Ying who wins this hand of mahjong, so we count points and begin again. "Did you know Lena moved to Woodside?" asks Auntie Ying with obvious pride, looking down at the tiles, talking to no one in particular. She quickly erases her smile and tries for some modesty. "Of course, it's not best house in neighborhood, not $1,000,000 house, not yet. But it's good investment, better than paying rent, better than somebody putting you under their thumb to rub you out." So now I know Auntie Ying's daughter, Lena, told her about my being evicted from my apartment on Lower Russian Hill. Even though Lena and I are still friends, we have grown naturally cautious about telling each other too much. Still, what little we say to one another often comes back in another guise. It's the same old game, everybody talking in circles. "It's getting late," I say, after we finish the round. I start to stand up, but Auntie Lin pushes me back down into the chair. "Stay, stay. We talk a while, get to know you again," she says. "Been a long time." I know this is a polite gesture on the Joy Luck Auntie's part, a protest when actually they are just as eager to see me go as I am to leave. "No, I really must go now. Thank you, I say, glad I remembered how the pretense goes. "But you must stay. We have something important to tell you from your mother," Auntie Ying blurts out in her too loud voice. The others look uncomfortable, as if this were not how they intended to break some sort of bad news to me. I sit down. Auntie Anmei leaves the room quickly and returns with a bowl of peanuts, then quietly shuts the door. Everybody is quiet, as if nobody knew where to begin. It is Auntie Ying who finally speaks. "I think your mother died with an important thought on her mind," she says in halting English. And then she begins to speak in Chinese, calmly, softly. "Your mother was a very strong woman, a good mother. She loved you very much, more than her own life. And that's why you can understand why a mother like this could never forget her other daughters. She knew they were alive, and before she died, she wanted to find her daughters in China." The babies in Guilin, I think. I was not those babies. The babies in a sling on her shoulder, her other daughters. And now I feel as if I were in Guilin amidst the bombing and I can see these babies lying on the side of the road, their red thumbs popped out of their mouths, screaming to be reclaimed. Somebody took them away. They're safe. And now my mother's left me forever, gone back to China to get these babies. I can barely hear Auntie Ying's voice. "She had searched for years, written letters back and forth," says Auntie Ying. "And last year she got an address. She was going to tell your father soon. Ay, what a shame. A lifetime of waiting." Auntie Anmei interrupts with an excited voice. "So your aunties and I, we wrote to this address," she says. "We say that a certain party, your mother, want to meet another certain party, and this party write back to us. They are your sisters, Jingmei." My sisters, I repeat to myself, saying these two words together for the first time. Auntie Anmei is holding a sheet of paper as thin as wrapping tissue. In perfectly straight vertical rows, I see Chinese characters written in blue fountain pen ink. A word is smudged. A tear? I take the letter with shaking hands, marveling at how smart my sisters must be to be able to read and write Chinese. The aunties are all smiling at me, as though I had been a dying person who has now miraculously recovered. Auntie Ying is handing me another envelope. Inside is a check made out to June Wu for $1,200. I can't believe it. My sisters are sending me money? I ask.
No, no, says Auntie Lin with her mock, exasperated voice. Every year, we save our mahjong winnings for big banquet at fancy restaurant. Most times, your mother win, so most is her money. We add just a little so you can go Hong Kong, take a train to Shanghai, see your sisters. Besides, we all getting too rich, too fat. She pats her stomach for proof. See my sisters, I say numbly. I am awed by this prospect, trying to imagine what I would see. And I am embarrassed by the end-of-the-year banquet lie my aunties have told to mask their generosity. I'm crying now, sobbing and laughing at the same time, seeing but not understanding this loyalty to my mother. You must see your sisters and tell them about your mother's death, says Auntie Ying. But most important, you must tell them about her life, the mother they did not know. They must now know. See my sisters. Tell them about my mother, I say, nodding. What will I say? What can I tell them about my mother? I don't know anything. She was my mother. The aunties are looking at me as if I had become crazy right before their eyes. Not know your own mother? Cries Auntie Anmei with disbelief. How can you say? Your mother is in your bones. Tell them stories of your family here. How she became success, offers Auntie Lin. Tell them stories she told you, lessons she taught, what you know about her mind that has become your mind, says Auntie Ying. Your mother, very smart lady. I hear more choruses of tell them, as each auntie frantically tries to think what should be passed on. Her kindness, her smartness, her dutiful nature to family, her hopes, things that matter to her, the excellent dishes she cooked. Imagine, a daughter not knowing her own mother. And then it occurs to me, they're frightened. In me, they see their own daughters, just as ignorant, just as unmindful of all the truths and hopes they have brought to America. They see daughters who grow impatient when their mothers talk in Chinese, who think they're stupid when they explain things in fractured English. They see that joy and luck do not mean the same to their daughters, that to these closed, American-born minds, joy luck is not a word. It does not exist. They see daughters who will bear grandchildren born without any connecting hope passed from generation to generation. I will tell them everything, I say simply, and the aunties look at me with doubtful faces. I will remember everything about her, and tell them, I say more firmly, and gradually, one by one, they smile and pat my hand. They still look troubled, as if something were out of balance, but they also look hopeful that what I say will become true. What more can they ask? What more can I promise? They go back to eating their soft-boiled peanuts, saying stories among themselves. They are young girls again, dreaming of good times in the past and good times yet to come. A brother from Ningbo who makes his sister cry with joy when he returns $9,000 plus interest. A youngest son whose stereo and TV repair business is so good he sends leftovers to China. A daughter whose babies are able to swim like fish in a fancy pool in Woodside. Such good stories. The best. They are the lucky ones. And I am sitting in my mother's place at the mahjong table, on the east, where things begin.